We certainly live in a magical time when not only are all the game books in the fighting fantasy line being reprinted, but we even have new ones. New ones are being written. And the last one that came out is The Gates of Death by Charlie Hickson. Very excited about this one. I'm a big fan of fighting fantasy, so I created my adventure, stamina, luck, skill, everything is in readiness, and now we can just start playing. So let's start from the beginning. Let's read together from paragraph 1, from section 1. You step up onto the gangplank and walk down to dockside. It feels good to have solid ground beneath your feet after being so long at sea, although you feel wobbly and unstable and are very sick from the voyage. You kneel down, intending to kiss dry land, and instead you heave up your last meal onto the cobblestones. Lose 5 stamina points. This is certainly how I feel and what I feel like doing when I read a game book that has stats, so it's not purely narrative. You have numerical values for certain things, and after you set up your adventure, you lose stamina right in the first section, or in any case before you can do anything. What is the point? If you wanted me to start with lower stamina, you could just integrate that as part of the setup. It just feels like a flaw, and it's annoying that actually that is exactly what happened at the beginning of Port of Peril. The previous book that came out in the Fighting Fantasy series, that was not a reprint but a new book. And so just like very bad omen, you start questioning the author and what the author really knows and understand about the conventions of the line, the convention of the game book form, how to structure the story and the narrative branch and all of the gaming aspects. And I have to say that that omen kind of like was accurate. It was really a sign of things to come, because then overall the book has been pretty disappointing. So right there you have my conclusions. Now, in the rest of my video, I'm going to give you a little more detail about what is disappointing and how, but there are also a couple of redeeming qualities, not enough in my opinion to really make up for the problems. The story, classic fighting fantasy, and I don't have any problem with that. Fighting fantasy, like so many lines of books, is about variations on a theme. You're trying to defeat a big villain, and you need to collect certain items, and there's a certain threat that the villain represents. And that is pretty much the mission, and you have a lot of ways of dying and only one way of succeeding. And here you have an evil villain that has been spreading around a disease that turns people into monsters out of the blue. You're chatting with somebody and the person turns into a monster because they're being contaminated by this mysterious agent virus, and you have to slaughter them now before they slaughter you. And so you're traveling across the world of Alanzia, classic fighting fantasy setting, and you start from very well-known places such as Port Blacksand. If you're familiar with fighting fantasy, you have been there and you have lived some really fun adventures in it. And then you travel from there, and you're trying to figure out what you need to collect and where it is that you can confront the final villain, and also what you can do to find a cure for the disease that is spreading around. Because of the disease, there's a little bit of that sci-fi theme there. The risk was sort of like post-apocalyptic world in the making. Is a pre-post-apocalyptic world, which I guess is a neologism that I just coined, and that's what I just did. So, not a problem in the plot, in the premise of the story, from the point of view of the story being very well known and similar to other ones. Again, I don't expect fighting fantasy books to reinvent the wheel every time. I'm just happy if they make it spin in a fun and smooth way. This one didn't all that much. The narrative tree. Oh, warning, there are going to be some minor spoilers here and there because of this, to discuss the structure, the things that are in there. I'm going to announce some of the things, but I'm going to keep it as mild as possible. However, you're warned if you keep watching spoilers of entity that I consider minor, but maybe you don't, may follow at any time without any further warning. This is the last one I'm giving you. The narrative structure, it's a little bit of what I call the pearl necklace. Imagine a pearl necklace, and so you have the pearls, and so the pearls are spherical, and then they well, the pearl ends and the next one begins, and so on and so forth. Another image, another metaphor for this is a snake that ate a bunch of bowling balls, and so you see that the shape is this one. That is to say, there is of course a starting point, and then there are a couple of mandatory points that you will reach unless you die before. And between these mandatory points, you can travel around and you're looking for different items, fighting different monsters, etc., etc. So the the narrative tree branches out, and then if you survive long enough, it goes to one of these obligated points in which you're moving to the next dungeon, the next city, the next area, in which again you can go around a little bit. It's not fully radial. There isn't all that much freedom to leave the main path. There are ways, of course, of getting from obligated point A to obligated point B, missing entirely some previous items. There is often here, like it happens sometimes in interactive fiction, the impression that by traveling through space you're actually traveling through time, which is not that exceptional. If I'm walking for a minute, I travel in space and time. The problem is that if I move back, I don't get younger by a minute. And in interactive fiction, sometimes that is the case. You move from room A to room B, and then you go back to room A, and the text is exactly the same. There's quite a bit of that. Also, there are a couple of magic portals that you will fall into, magic gates, and they bring you back in time. Also, this may be a spoiler, sorry about this. I said I wouldn't give you a warning, but I want to give you this one. When you fall into a magic portal, you're asked if you remember a certain magic formula that you may or may not have encountered before, and you're given a certain option of 3 formulas that kind of sound the same. Well, guess what? If you remember it, every time that you fall into one of these magic gates, the answer is always the same. There's just one formula that works to prevent negative effects when you fall into a magic gate portal. So what is the point of repeating the same quiz or puzzle every time? If you know the answer once, you know the answer every time. From the point of view of the way things are connected, there are also a couple of other oddities, on top of the fact that it's pretty irritating if you from time to time have to go back in time. A couple of oddities such as there is a passage where you have a magic fountain. If you get there, and you drink from it to recover a point of stamina. That's great. The problem is that you can move between that passage and the adjacent ones back and forth as many times as you want. Again, the idea is it feels like you're moving freely in space. Time seems to be frozen because every time that you enter in that room, which is always the same sequence, you're gonna get a sip from the magic fountain and recover a stamina. Then you walk to a previous hallway, go back. Oh, there's a fountain here. Do I want to drink from it? Yes, sir. And I drink from it. So basically in that area you can go around, kill a monster. Doesn't matter how severely wounded your hero is. Then you retrace back your way back to the fountain, and you go back and forth until you have recovered stamina entirely. Go there, kill another monster, recover entirely, etc., etc. This kind of flaw in the narrative tree would have been annoying in 1982, 1983. By 2018, it is just sad. This is the first book that this author, Charlie Higson, and I don't know anything about him. I've never read anything by him before. It's the first book in the line, and I don't know that this author took the time to really do all the homework. Maybe he was a fan back in the day. And gets certain and got a sense of how it's done, but then there are just all these weird loose loopholes in the narrative tree that make the adventure all not that exciting. At least just there are moments in which the tension is reduced because you realize that there are ways in which you can exploit the narrative tree, or ways in which the narrative tree makes the game less interesting. Another thing that I have a problem with is the tone of the story. This author this author looks to me like he couldn't make up his mind whether he wanted to write a fighting fantasy book or a parody. Either one is fine. There are some really inventive, hilarious parodies of fighting fantasy books. This is not one because the story takes itself too seriously. But then there are references to pop culture, there are weird images, weird ideas that completely break the tension, break the illusion of the dark, dangerous world of Alancia. Too much tongue-in-cheekness here and there, and then all of a sudden I'm switching from I'm excited about the adventure to oh, the author and I are exchanging jokes, wink, wink, blink, blink, haha. That I got that reference, funny. Choose one. Again, choose one. Just to give an example of a pop reference, which, by the way, is not a spoiler because a pop reference that comes up everywhere. You constantly stumble upon bottles of this perfume called Nostalgia. It looks like the world of Valencia has been littered by a factory of Nostalgia went out of business. They just gave away all of their perfume bottles and they got scattered all over Valencia. And if you know anything about comic books, you should know about the perfume called Nostalgia. If you don't get the reference, I'll leave it to you to figure out what that is. Very famous pop reference for people that are into comic books. And it just now all of a sudden to have my hero that is picking up a bottle of perfume, which is already weird, which reminds me of a graphic novel that I love very much, that I read a million times. It just weakens the tension. And then there is what will probably become one of the most famous monsters in the fighting fantasy canon, and not for the right reasons, not because it's very iconic, because it's scary, because it's powerful, but just because of his gratuitous pointlessness. It's outrageous, just being weird for the sake of it. And yes, you may have even seen pictures of this monster already. It is the bum-faced monsters, the butt-faced monster, which is exactly what you see here. By the way, this is just particularly weird and outrageous. And clearly the author was like, what monster has not been done? This. And I'm like, okay, fine, not fine. To me, just the pointlessness. It doesn't add to the atmosphere. It reduces the atmosphere. I remember reading the old fighting fantasy books when you're in the dark and there are some monsters like in Citadel of Chaos. I think you know which one I'm referring to. Those were terrifying scenes. These monsters had a certain gravitas, had really an atmosphere that surrounded them. And of course, if I read a fighting fantasy book now, even one that I hadn't read before, I don't expect to be scared anymore because I'm over 40. I'm not 10, 11, or 12 anymore. But I still appreciate a consistent atmosphere. Which is not what you have here. You have certain sequences that are pretty exciting actually. There is a sequence where you're trying to get out of a city that is being overwhelmed by hordes of citizens turning into demons, and that's interesting and fun and exciting. And then you have the reference to pop culture. You have the bum face monster. The two levels just don't go well with one another, just don't integrate well. And so there are all these problems that really prevented me from engaging with the game, with the book all that much. From the point of view of the challenge, it is not one of the hardest out there. It's not Creator of Havoc, worry not. It's not even one of those in which you have endless laundry lists of items to collect. You do have to do a little bit of treasure hunt, and that's perfectly fine. It's not too hard, which is not a minus nor a plus. It's fun from time to time to have a fighting fantasy book that do not reduce you into a crying blob of sadness and disappointment and guilt and shame because it's just impossible to solve. I'd say the level that's not particularly hard. The level of challenges is just fine. I enjoyed that. And for all those things that I didn't like at all about the book, including the art, not just because of the bum face monster, but in general, I just don't particularly like this new art. It's just simplistic, lacks of detail. lacks the powerful, evocative black and white of the beginning. Shades of gray, just a much less interesting, I believe. And you may complain. Wait a second, Mark. You just admitted that you're not 10 or 11, so you're not the target audience of this book. Do you have any right to complain about it? Yes, because I bought it with my money. I picked it up. I hope to enjoy it, and I didn't enjoy it all that much. And I read comic books and books for children all the time with my daughters, and some of those I enjoy very much. Sometimes I read books for children or young adults for my own pleasure, and I still enjoy them. Superhero comics, the fact that a 13-year-old can enjoy them doesn't mean that I don't enjoy them. Some I enjoy, some I don't. Also, frankly, I'm glad if there are new readers that are approaching the fighting fantasy series for the first time. They were born in the new millennium. They don't know about the old world, and they're just approaching. I'm sure that there are some youngsters out there that are discovering fighting fantasy, but I'd be surprised if at least half of the people that actually pick up and buy this book were not my generation, that read fighting fantasy back in the day, and then either they're returning to the series or they kept the faith for all of these years. It's also very probable that some 12, 14, 13-year-old that are discovering the book for the first time, they're picking up from the library, maybe at their school, whereas people of my generation, they're buying it because we want to add it to our collection. So I believe that at least half of the buyers of this book are adult, nostalgic readers that maybe are going to be a little more demanding than a 12-year-old, but I don't feel that because of that doesn't make us part of the target audience. In fact, a successful fighting fantasy that comes out in 2018 should be able to satisfy both. And there is no problem doing that. If I reread some of the old ones that I read 30 years ago, I still enjoy them. This one, 30 years from now, I don't know that I'll enjoy it all much more. So, having taken into account the problem of the generation and the fact that I believe that you and I, my viewer, are part of the target, and we deserve to enjoy this book. We deserve, when we buy a fighting fantasy book, to expect an enjoyable one. After all this complaining that I did, I have to say, despite everything, I found myself drawn into the book to a degree. Enough at least to complete it. I would say the disappointment was not as severe as the one that I had when I read Port of Peril, the previous 21st century fighting fantasy book. Maybe because that one came from one of the masters of the form, and so to see that the master had lost his touch and seemed to have forgotten the basics was even more disappointing than seeing here that there's a new author that is not quite there yet. And yet at least some situations were enjoyable. Sometimes, again, the humor to me and the pop references were misplaced, but there were some interesting action sequences, there were some interesting, exciting moments, some supporting characters that I found strangely fascinating and charming. Of course, you know that most of them are going to be doomed because this is not an endless quest book in which you had a companion from beginning to end. You know, the companions in fighting fantasy are often doomed. Still, there's some interesting supporting characters there. I have to say, I don't know if it's a spoiler or not, I will not tell you exactly the details, but I really liked the ending. Or the endings. You know very well, with fighting fantasy, there is one path to victory, and everything else is complete absolute annihilation, oblivion, and destruction. Few books in the old series challenged that. There were some that challenged that, for example, that put a negative ending in the famous paragraph 400, and they hid the only positive ending somewhere else. So they challenged the one true path by giving you a couple of possible endings. One was optimal and the other ones weren't all that terrible, and so it was up to you to decide if it was a victory or not. It gave you that nuance. Again, I will not tell you what happens in the ending or the endings, but I will tell you that I appreciate the fact that in fact here you have at least two plausible endings in which you will survive the adventure, and it's pretty much left to you to assess which one is the optimal victory. One is described as the optimal victory, especially the other one I have to say, it was pretty fun. It's a pretty fun outcome. I like the fact that there is that innovation here that has been done before, but we haven't seen it in a while. And it felt particularly refreshing to see that there was more than one way of surviving the story and having a somewhat satisfying ending. I hope that was not too much spoiler. Also, now we have more, like it happens recent game books are longer than they were before. Again, to me, that is another sign that at least in part the authors are taking into account an older target audience. Old fighting fantasy books tended to be 400 paragraphs. This one is 470. Other books were even shorter than this one. The fact that the new ones are chubbier, there is more meat, and gives us more things to explore and to discover. Again, to me, is a sign that at least partially they're targeting older or more demanding readers. So it's fun to me to find a longer book, and it's fine to me that now, because we go to 470, I don't know if the ideal optimal ending is going to be a 470, the last one, or they're going to keep it a 400. If our decision says go to 400, if I have a bifurcation in the text and one of the decisions is 400, now I don't know what 400 really stands for. So actually there is another advantage here. The famous 400 almost always corresponded to victory. Here, there is that uncertainty. So, maybe because of the severe disappointment that I received from the previous unpublished Fighting Fantasy, Port of Peril, this one was disappointing, but not as much. I was still able to enjoy it here and there. Overall, still nothing past mediocre in my opinion, and not even probably all that mediocre. Maybe in the lower range of the category of mediocre, not in the high range, almost good. I'm glad that I have it, just because I want to have every fighting fantasy book, and I like to have them in my collection. But fairly underwhelming, definitely. Fairly underwhelming and somewhat disappointing experience. If you're just looking for a good fighting fantasy book, go and look for the old ones, because I find this to be not particularly enjoyable. If you're a completist and you want to add to your collection, well, I don't know what I've been watching this video also all this time, since you probably were planning to buy it, or you have bought the game already. Maybe it is just to listen to my charming Mediterranean accent, and that is fine too. In which case, thank you for watching. Hey, even more thank you than if you watched it to actually learn about the book. Either way, The Gates of Death, not particularly great. I hope that they're able in the future to recruit writers that are more in symphony with what fighting fantasy has been and could be, or that this author figures out a thing or two. As is, there's a pretty underwhelming new installment in the series.